Rotarians. More than a century ago, two men, one a black educator and the other an American Jewish businessman, began a journey to build schools to educate African American children in the segregated South. The two men, Sears Roebuck President Julius Rosenwald and revered African American educator Booker T. Washington, forged a partnership to create the Rosenwald Schools. Fast forward to today. This philanthropic effort inspired two other men, one white and one black, close friends for decades, to honor and preserve the history and the deep impact of the Rosenwald Schools through their own passions for social justice through arts. Today, Rotary is honored to have Andrew Feiler and fellow Rotarian Doug Hooker here to discuss the amazing history of the Rosenwald Schools, their personal friendship, and the journey that brought them to bring this story to life through photography, essays, and music. Andrew Feiler is a photographer and author and a fifth-generation Georgian. Having grown up Jewish in Savannah, he has been shaped by the rich complexities of the American South. Feiler's newest book of photography, A Better Life for Their Children, the Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, and the 4,978 Schools That Changed America, was recently published by the University of Georgia Press, and it is available for sale outside. Doug Hooker will soon retire as the executive director of the Atlanta Regional Commission that he has led for the past 10 years. Although he has no formal degrees in music performance or music composition, music has been a lifelong hobby of his. For many years, he has also composed music, including several large ensemble pieces for orchestra or band, works for small instrument groups, choral works, and songs. His most recent large-scale work is his second symphony, Without Regard to Sex, Race, or Color, which had its world premiere at the First Center on February 6, 2022. I think it's fair to say that each of us, when we consider philanthropy in our lives, hope that 100 years from now, people will remember what we did with our donations. And I think what Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington did, the fact that we're still talking about it today, this shows what the power of giving and philanthropy can do for a community. With that, I'd like to welcome Andrew and Doug to the stage for our discussion.
Cue the slides here. Here we go. One of the great joys in my life is my artistic collaboration with Doug Hooker. This book, which came out in the spring, it has been an extraordinary run. I'm going to talk about the book and the story of the Rosenwald Schools. Is a prelude to the conversation that Doug and I will have about our creative collaboration and Doug's art. This book came out in the spring. It was featured in this glorious double-page spread on the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal, Smithsonian Magazine, 2 milestones for any photographer, CBS News, NPR. This book is in its 3rd printing. And in photography terms, it's a bestseller. It's been a transformative experience. I want to start with a simple premise. The Rosenwald Schools are one of the most transformative moments in the first half of the 20th century. It dramatically reshapes the African American experience. It dramatically reshapes America, and yet it remains hidden history, and its scope and sweep are largely unknown. Okay. Are we advancing here? There we go. This is a photograph of a photograph, a portrait of Julius Rosenwald that hangs in the Noble Hill School in Bartow County, Georgia. That's about an hour up I-75. Julius Rosenwald, born to Jewish immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Germany, he grows up in Springfield, Illinois, across the street from Abraham Lincoln's home. And he rises to become the president of Sears, Roebuck and Company. And with innovations like Satisfaction Guaranteed or Your Money Back, he turns Sears into the world's largest retailer of its era. And motivated by his Judaism, he becomes one of the earliest and greatest philanthropists in American history. And his cause is what only later becomes known as civil rights. This is a portrait of Booker T. Washington that hangs above the mantle at the president's house at what is now Tuskegee University. Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Virginia, attends Hampton College, becomes an educator, and is the founding principal of the historically black college in Tuskegee, Alabama, originally known as Tuskegee Institute. This is a rare portrait of the two men together, printed on fabric and sewn into a quilt to commemorate the restoration of the Pine Grove School in Richland County, South Carolina. And at the rededication ceremony, former students and former teachers were invited to sign the quilt, and it hangs today in the restored schoolhouse. In fact, the image on the cover of my book is the restored classroom in that schoolhouse, and in the back left-hand corner, you can see this quilt hanging. Julius Rosenwald and Booker T. Washington meet in 1911, just over 110 years ago. And you have to remember, 1911 is before the Great Migration. So 90% of African Americans live in the South. And public schools for African Americans are mostly shacks, with a fraction of the funding provided for the education of white children. Many jurisdictions do not even have public schools for African Americans. And in 1912, these two men create a program that becomes known as Rosenwald Schools. This is a portrait of students and teachers standing proudly in front of the Jefferson Jacob School in Jefferson County, Kentucky, that's Louisville, carrying the hopes and dreams of their communities. They reach out to the black communities of the South, and they say, if you will contribute to a school, because we want you to be a full partner in your progress, and we will count as your contribution, cash, land, material, or labor. And if you'll reach out to the school board, the white school board, because we want to be deliberate in creating a vector for future dialogue between blacks and whites, and these have to be public schools. While we welcome the school system's contribution, at a minimum, they have to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. If you do those two things, Julius Rosenwald will make a substantial contribution towards school construction. Think about this. The black community has to contribute. This is one of the earliest examples of challenge grants. The white school board has to be involved. This is one of the earliest examples of public-private partnership. And between 1912, when the community of Lochapoka in Lee County, Alabama, becomes the first community to raise the matching funds, until 1937, when President Roosevelt presides over the dedication of what is the last Rosenwald School, the Eleanor Roosevelt School in Meriwether County, Georgia. That's Warm Springs. 1912 to 1937, this program builds 4,978 schools across 15 southern and border states. And the results are transformative. There's two economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago who have done 5 studies of Rosenwald schools. And what their data shows is that prior to World War I, there was a large and persistent black-white education gap in the South. That gap closes precipitously between World War I and World War II, and the single greatest driver of that achievement, and that is an achievement, is Rosenwald schools. In addition, many of the leaders and foot soldiers of the civil rights movement to come through these schools. Medgar Evers, Maya Angelou, 5 of the members of the Little Rock Nine who integrate Little Rock Central High, and Congressman John Lewis all attended Rosenwald schools. Congressman John Lewis, who wrote this absolutely glorious introduction to my book. In fact, Doug, in our collaboration on this project, Doug had an early advance copy of this, and he called me up in tears, having just read Congressman Lewis's beautiful introduction, in which he talks about going to school in a Rosenwald school, the role that education played in his life. This photograph was taken the day I was working with Congressman Lewis in his office It was October 29th of 2019. It was exactly 60 days later, on December 29th of 2019, that Congressman Lewis went public with his pancreatic cancer diagnosis. His contribution to this work is one of Congressman Lewis's last public acts. So this is the oldest surviving Rosenwald school, the Emory School in Hale County, Alabama. I had never heard of Rosenwald Schools until February of 2015, when I found myself at lunch with Jeannie Syriac, who originated the role of African American Heritage Specialist at the Georgia State Historic Preservation Office, and the story shocked me. I'm a fifth-generation Jewish Georgian. I've been a progressive activist my entire life. The pillars of this story are the pillars of my life. How could I never heard of Rosenwald Schools? So I came home and I Googled it, and I found that there were a number of academic books on the topic, but there was not a comprehensive photographic account of the program. And so I set out to do exactly that. And over the next 3.5 years, I drove 25,000 miles across all 15 of the program states. Of the original 4,978 Rosenwald schools, about 500 survive. Only half of those have been restored. I shot 105 of those surviving schools, and the result is this book. This is inside the Emory School. This is what is known as a one-teacher school. That is the Hope School in Pomeria, South Carolina. This is what's known as a two-teacher school. If you go today to the National Museum of African American History and Culture on the National Mall, you will find from this schoolhouse 6 school desks, 1 potbelly stove, and the original sign proclaiming Hope School. This is what's known as a two-teacher school. The 3-teacher school, the Pleasant Plains School in Hartford County, North Carolina. Now, note, these are 1, 2, and 3-teacher schools, all small white clapboard structures. By the end of the program, they're building 1, 2, and 3-story red brick buildings. This is the Dunbar School in Pulaski County, Arkansas, otherwise known as Little Rock. Now, I knew this was an amazing story, but how do you tell it visually? I started out shooting exteriors, and it's a fascinating architectural narrative. But with only half of the only 10% of the schools surviving and only half of those restored, I realized that the adaptive reuse narrative was so important. So many of these schools were small that they were outgrown as educational facilities long ago. In fact, of the 105 schools I went to, only 5 are still in use for educational purposes. So I had to tell the adaptive reuse narrative, and to do that, I had to get inside, and to do that, I needed permission. And it was in that process that I met all these extraordinary people, former students, former teachers, preservationists, civic leaders, and I bring their stories into this narrative through portraits. These are the Pleasant Hill Quilters in Cass County, Texas. The school, 3 of these women had parents that attended Rosenwald Schools. 3 of these women attended Rosenwald Schools, and LaJoyce Flanagan, who's at the center of the front row, was a teacher in this school. These women quilted to raise the money to restore the Pleasant Plains School and to turn Pleasant Hill School to turn it into the community center that it is today. And the women meet on most Mondays in the schoolhouse to quilt. Some of these schools have become church halls. Many were built next to churches because the churches led their fundraising efforts in their communities. Some are museums. This is the Warfield School in Montgomery County, Tennessee, with this photograph of Abraham Lincoln and the pattern of these 9-over-9 pane windows that are an iconic feature of Rosenwald School's architecture. But many remain in disrepair. This is the Hannah School, which stands across from the Hannah AME Church, where the graveyard of the church has grown up around the school. You see the schoolhouse is in great disrepair, at risk of collapse. These buildings are a locus of history and memory in our communities, and when we lose those historic resources, we lose a part of our soul. And indeed, I came across schools on this journey that had collapsed so recently that they were surrounded by yellow caution tape or emergency fencing. This is the W.E.B. Du Bois School in Wake County, North Carolina. But I said the emotional heart of this story was the people that I met. This portrait of Julius Rosenwald hangs above the doorway of the K. Rose School in Sumner County, Tennessee. It has been there since the schoolhouse opened in 1923. These are brothers Frank and Charles Brinkley. They both attended this school. They both went to college. They both went to graduate school. They both became educators. Frank became a high school math and science teacher. Charles becomes a middle school principal. They have 4 sisters, all went through this school, all went to college. These 6 siblings have 10 children. All 10 children went to college. That legacy may not have happened without this schoolhouse. The Bay Springs School in Forest County, Mississippi. This is the story of Vernon Damer Sr. Vernon Damer's grandfather donated the 2 acres of land for this school. Vernon Damer attended this school. When the schoolhouse closed in 1958, Vernon Damer's grandfather, had been smart enough to build in a reversionary clause. So the schoolhouse reverted to Vernon Damer, who turned it into a center of civil rights activism. SNCC met here, the NAACP met here. And when Vernon Damer, who was head of the NAACP in Forest County, drove African Americans into Hattiesburg to attempt to register to vote, he had them park behind the schoolhouse so they could not be identified by their vehicles and harassed. All of this activity, as you can imagine, drew the attention of the KKK. And on the night of January 10th, 1966, Vernon Damer's home was firebombed by the Grand Wizard of the KKK and 3 other henchmen. And Vernon Damer stood in the window of his house with a shotgun holding off the attackers while his wife Ellie got their children out the back door. And Vernon Damer died as a result of his injuries in that fire. This is Ellie Damer, the widow of Vernon Damer, who attended inside the Bay Springs School. Ellie Damer went to a different Rosenwald school in Mississippi, went to college, came back and taught in this schoolhouse. And when this schoolhouse closed in 1958, she was denied employment at the new school because of her husband's activism, and she had to get a job at a school district 35 miles away, and she taught there for 21 years. Their son Dennis has recently completed a restoration of the schoolhouse to bring it back to its community center roots. The last schoolhouse I'm going to tell you about is the Hopewell School in Bastrop County, Texas, here at the last stages of its renovation. This is inside the schoolhouse. You see the mottled texture on the wall, that's primer. There's plastic sheeting on the ground. On the floor, the potbelly stove on the right is wrapped. The photograph in the center of this image is from the 19th century. This is Sophia and Martin Mcdonald. They were both born into slavery. Upon emancipation, they started raising farm animals. They acquired some land, they acquired some more land. They eventually acquired 1,200 acres. And when the Rosenwald Schools program came to Bastrop County, Texas in 1919, they donated 2 acres of land for the school. Its first teacher was their daughter. One of her first students was her daughter, Sophia Williams, shown on the right here, holding up this portrait of her grandparents. Her husband, Elroy Williams, on the left, went to a different Rosenwald school in Bastrop County. They both went to college. They both came back and had an entire career as educators in Bastrop County. And now they're in the final stages of leading the restoration of this schoolhouse. I found this story time and time again. Students becoming teachers, becoming the keepers of history and memory in their communities. And it was one of the reasons why I decided to write a story that goes with every photograph, or in some cases pairs of photographs in this book, because I found Rosenwald Schools directly connected to the Trail of Tears, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Tuskegee Airmen, murder, embezzlement, and those are part of this body of work. So I want to just comment before I transition to bring Doug into this story about the title of this work. Julius Rosenwald was looking for a better life for his children. Booker T. Washington was looking for a better life for his children. The African American communities that were already being taxed to pay for white schools were looking for better lives for their children. At the heart of this story, Julius Rosenwald, Booker T. Washington, white-black communities, white school boards, are people who reached across divisions of race, religion, and region and fundamentally changed this country. And to all of us in a room like this this speaks to us because it reminds us that individual actions matter and that we can and do change the world. We can and do change Atlanta. So Doug Hooker and I have been friends for more than 20 years. We have served on boards together. We have been in political campaigns together. And not quite 20 years ago, we found ourselves sitting next to each other at a civic gathering talking about our art. We were both starting down the paths of taking our art more seriously, mercifully being taken more seriously. This is before Doug's first symphony was performed. This was before my first book came out. My earlier book is a portrait of an largely abandoned college campus. It's the campus here in Atlanta of Morris Brown College. I will preface this by saying I am thrilled that Morris Brown is on its path back to reaccreditation. These images were shot in 2013, right after Morris Brown College filed for bankruptcy. And the title comes from an inscription on the school bell that hangs in the tower above Morris Brown College. That bell was hung in May of 1888, and the inscription reads in part, "Dedicated to the education of youth without regard to sex, race, or color." This book came out in 2015. It's a portrait of, it uses these education spaces we are all so familiar with. We have been in these hallways, we have been in these dorm rooms, we have been in these classrooms. We're used to seeing them populated by people and not by ghosts, and that emotional resonance creates a space to talk about the importance of historically black colleges. Indeed, there were originally about 120 historically black colleges. We're down to about 100. Those 100 colleges are 3% of colleges in America. They are 10% of African Americans who go to college and more than 25% of African Americans who earn degrees, which replants this story. In the center of this core societal debate we have today, how do we create opportunity in America and an on-ramp to the American middle class? And there's a broader narrative that this work speaks to, which is that education has been the backbone of the American dream, the access point to the American middle class since before there was a United States of America. The first taxpayer-funded school in America was created in 1644. It's just over 375 years ago. And there's a direct connection between that, land-grant colleges, historically black colleges, Rosenwald Schools, the educational provisions of the GI Bill, Brown versus Board of Education. Today we are talking about college affordability, college access crisis. This is a 375-year tradition that is at risk, and that's what this book was about. And when the book came out, there was an exhibition of this work. There's an exhibition of the work of this current book that's traveling the country. It was up at the National Center for Civil and Human Rights the latter half of last year. It's now in Charlotte. It's about to travel to Memphis, Richmond, Nashville, New Orleans, and beyond. This book, the exhibition of this work traveled for 4.5 years, 9 different venues, and I was invited to speak at Serenbe on a Sunday morning to a group of people that gather each weekend, an ecumenical group, and I was asked to speak about the role of values in my art. And a woman came up to me afterwards and she said, "Your work has this emotional resonance. Have you thought about setting it to music?" Answer, no. But I immediately thought of Doug, and I'll let Doug pick up the story from here.
And so, we were having a dinner one evening in October of 2017. We always check in with each other several times throughout the year, just what's happening in your life, what's happening in community, what's happening with your art. And so we're doing this, and this is halfway through the run of his original book, which he thought it would have 2 showings and that would be the end of it. And now we're 2 years plus into it. And he says, this is going to go to the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis at the Lorraine Hotel, where Dr. King was assassinated in 2019, early 2019. And I said, great, that's wonderful. And he said, I've got this crazy idea. And I said, what's that? Would you be willing to write some music to the book? And I said, music to the book? And he says, yeah, I said, well, what are you looking for? You want, pictures as an exhibition kind of approach, a different theme for every picture? He said, no, you know my story, you know this story, whatever resonates with you. And so I began the journey upon his invitation to write what I thought would be a 3-movement symphony. And I said, I'm going to get the first movement done in time for Memphis, and we can actually have it played while your exhibit goes up. And oh, by the way, I'm probably going to name the piece, the 3 movements, after your book. Is that okay? I'm honored that you do that. Great. And so I wrote the first movement. It was called A Heavy Lift. And of course, that's what historically black colleges and universities had to do. In the wake of the Civil War, in the wake of Reconstruction, when most of these schools are founded, they are being asked to lift a whole race of people out of a state of poverty and give them access and opportunity to at least our version of the American dream that was possible in that time. And so I wrote this first movement called the Heavy Lift. And so with that, I'm going to show you a quick clip from part of the symphony that was just premiered in February. We had this first movement actually played in Memphis in March of 2019, and it was very well received. And people said, "Well, what's going to happen with the rest of it?" I said, "Well, that'll take care of itself later." But this first movement in celebrating HBCUs, for those of you who are familiar with, for those of you who are not familiar with historically black colleges and universities, the band is the spirit of the institution. And so this whole concept, the phenomena of the Battle of the Bands, which I'm sure many of you have heard about now, was basically created by African-American community because people don't go to the football games to see the football team, they go to see the band. And it's a big deal when your rivals are coming and the football team comes, it's the band that everybody wants to see, whose band outdoes each other. So this particular clip is going to resonate the spirit of the HBCU band. And I use narrators, the soloists, the vocal soloists also serve as narrators, and they talk about the joy of being in a place where their blackness is unconstrained. It's not held against them. It's a freedom that they don't get in the rest of their existence before college and not after college. So if we can play this first clip.
Now you are in a place where you feel the joy of your blackness throughout your entire being. Feel the love. Embrace the love. Enjoy the love. Love yourself.
Thank you.
Trey Clegg conducting.
Trey Clegg was the conductor of the orchestra, which is another great story for another time. But flash forward, so we had the premiere in Memphis, March 2019, and Andrew and I continued to get together about all kinds of things. And then that fall again, he says, well, I'm working on the second book. I can't figure out what the title is yet, but I'm working on the second book about Rosenwald Schools. I, too, had never heard about Rosenwald Schools, which I found fascinating, being the son of parents and grandparents who believed in education very much so, and were insisting that all of their children and grandchildren get education in high school and beyond. And all of my siblings and most of my cousins have all gone on to greater heights with university. But he said, I'm doing this second book now. Do you think you can write the second movement? I said, okay. He said, because you had originally envisioned a 3-movement thing. And I said, yeah, I had envisioned that. He said, well, I'd like to have the second movement now, please. And I was like, okay, all right. And so I went back and thought about it, and I said, well, does the second movement have to be about the first book? Because I really think I'm thinking about the second book now. And he says, whatever you want to do. And I said, great, okay. And so I wrote this piece, and it's called J.R. and Booker T. Julius Rosenwald was known by his family and close friends as J.R. And Booker T. Washington, of course, a famous African-American educator. And I want to talk about the dynamism of the two men and each of their individual influences on this country, but how their partnership took us to another place in this country that I don't think Atlanta would be what it is without the Civil Rights Movement. And certainly the Civil Rights Movement would not have been what it was without the partnership of these two men that allowed for a lot of African Americans to get educated where previously they were denied that. So this particular clip comes from the partnership theme of the second piece, which of course is a lot longer than this, but just a real short demonstration of the partnership piece. And it's all instrumental at this point in time. And anyway, I will say that Andrew's invitation to me to express my art and reflection of his art was probably one of the greatest joys I've experienced as a person and certainly as an artist and composer. The third movement, after we finished with the second movement, I told him, I said, I'm kind of wrapping it up. And he says, I guess I'm going to have to do a third book to get the third movement. And I said, no, you don't have to do that. Actually, the third movement began to speak to me exactly what it needed to be as I was wrapping up the second movement. And I said, it's not about the past, it's not about the present, it's about an aspirational future, a place when I am free to be. And I use that English deliberately, a place when and a time where I am free. Thinking of space-time continuum that Einstein said we live in. Space and time are not separate things, but they're joint phenomena. And so this whole movement that involves orchestra, soloists, and a large chorus basically speaks to a time when race is no longer the straitjacket of our existence. And it's a future and a time that we are not experiencing now, but that I believe is possible somewhere out in that time and place long beyond my lifetime, probably. And so this third movement is called A Place When I Can Be, and this is nearing the climax of the piece, so let's play that, and then we can take any questions you might have for me and Andrew.
for such a beautiful and inspiring program. It is such a reminder that when we step outside of the walls of division that we often live in, that people can make great change and create beautiful art also in the process. We have a few minutes for questions. I had one I wanted to kick off with. Most of the folks that were shown in the photos are of an older generation. Do you see a younger generation taking up the mantle of the Rosenwald Schools and preserving that?
Yeah, I'd say two things. I think it's still on. Yeah, we're good. There are 21 portraits in this book. That include, some of them are group portraits. There's 47 people. 5 of them have since died, including Congressman Lewis. This history, this memory is perishable. And I kind of feel like I got to this story just in time. But the answer to your question is yes. In fact, the portrait that I shared with you of Elroy and Sophia Williams holding up this portrait of her grandparents, the person who got me access to them was a man named David Porter, who works for a nonprofit in Austin, Texas that does historic preservation. And he took it upon himself to raise the money that allowed them to restore that schoolhouse. So yes, there are lots of the leadership that is coming in the restoration. It is the former students and the former teachers that are driving the passion, but a lot of the legwork is being done by younger generations.
It's great to hear.
And also a small world story tied to that is the construction company that donated all of their labor to do the restoration of that school. The husband and wife. The wife was a secretary of mine way back in the day when I was Public Works Commissioner. She's since moved on, and she and her husband started this construction company. When I told her about this project, her husband had just died. And I told her about Andrew's thing, and she said, that was the school that we did. That was the school. And so I've told Andrew that story. In fact, I sent him a photograph of their grandkids holding picture of Andrew's book. So,
Are there questions from the audience? Yes, Charlie.
Why is so little known about the Rosenwald School movement?
So Julius Rosenwald was one of the earliest philanthropists to specify that all the funds would be spent down within a certain number of years of his death. Julius Rosenwald believed that the generation that helped create the wealth should benefit from the philanthropy that came with that wealth. And so he mandated that all the funds would be spent within 25 years of his death. In fact, he died in 1932, and 15 years they spent down the funds, and the Rosenwald Fund shuts down in 1948. This has become very fashionable in philanthropy today, right? Bill Gates has said this, Warren Buffett has said this, here in Atlanta, Bernie Marcus has said this. It was unheard of at the time, but that's one of the reasons why Julius Rosenwald's name is less well known than some of his philanthropic peers like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford that have surviving foundations.
Any other questions from the audience? Yeah, Billy.
That's a good question. So you saw, one of the photographs I showed was of the students and teachers out in front of the Jefferson Jacobs School in Kentucky. All of my bodies of work have been in color. But photography actually plays an important story in the history of this program. The program begins with a pilot of 6 schools, all close to Tuskegee, where Booker T. Washington and his team can keep an eye on them. And he has photographs made of these students and teachers standing in front of their schools. And he sends them to Julius Rosenwald, who writes back that he is so moved that he is committing to expanding the program. And these photographs continue to be made throughout the history of the program. They're an important part of the visual narrative of this story. And in honor of that role that photography played in shaping this history, I decided to shoot this entire body of work, not just in black and white, but entirely horizontal, because that's the linearity of these school structures and of these photographs.
Question?
Were any of these schools picked up by public school system, or they all remain private?
No, this part of the mandate is that they had to be public schools. So the public school system had to agree to own, maintain, and staff the school, pay for the teachers. So they were all parts of their public school systems. Now, in the very, very beginning of the program, almost all the money is coming from the black community and Julius Rosenwald. Later, as the program accelerates, more and more of the money is actually contributed by the white school system. That's in part because Julius Rosenwald's participation is giving them air cover, but it is also in part because the Great Migration is accelerating, and the South is losing its workforce. And the white leadership understands that if it's going to keep the African American workforce of the South, it has to provide better educational opportunities. So by the end of the program, a lot of the money is actually coming from the public school system.
And Doug, what are your plans for your symphony, and how will you use this to kind of promote this message?
Well, plans. I wish I could say I had an elaborate schedule that I can pass out to you. I'm currently in conversation with artistic leaders in Charlotte. We're hoping to get the symphony mounted and promoted done there while Andrew's exhibit is still up in Charlotte. But if not, we'll chase him. I mean, we might be chasing his exhibit all over. There's interest in South Bend, Indiana, where Notre Dame is, and also in Charlotte, and potentially having concerts there. So we'll see. Maybe I can get the ASO to do it at some point in time. Ooh.
Well, I will add that after the symphony, among the thousands of social media posts, there was one where somebody said, who was there, that this was such a magical evening and such an Atlanta evening, that he hoped that this would become a regular feature of the celebration of Black History Month in Atlanta, and I share that aspiration for Doug.
We'll see.
Well, please join me in thanking Doug and Andrew. And if you are interested, there are copies of the book for sale, as well as I believe the music is also for sale out in the lobby. And please join us next week for Sally Yates, former Deputy Attorney General. She will be our speaker with us next week. Bye-bye, everyone. Have a great day.